The neon lights flickered outside the rusted Talon, their sickly glow barely cutting through the thick smog that choked the streets of Xyrax 7. The planet wasn't the kind of place you ended up by choice. It was where criminals, mercenaries, and those running from something bigger than themselves came to disappear. Laws didn't exist here, only strength, reputation, and the ability to survive. Elias Grant stepped through the bar's entrance, his long coat sweeping the dusty floor as he moved. He didn't look around, didn't acknowledge the eyes that immediately turned toward him. It wasn't every day that a human walked into a place like this. He made his way to the bar, the hum of conversation dipping ever so slightly as he passed. He was used to it by now. Out here in the far reaches of space, humans were more of a myth than a reality. They weren't part of the major galactic alliances, didn't have vast fleets or colonies stretching across the stars. Most species had never even met one. And those who had told conflicting stories, some said humans were weak, fragile things, unsuited for the harsh realities of space. Others, the ones who had survived encounters, whispered something different. The bartender was a four-armed Vortali, his exoskeleton a dull gray under the dim lights. He glanced at Elias with mild curiosity but didn't ask questions. "What'll it be?" "Whiskey," Elias said. "Strongest you've got." The bartender gave a clicking chuckle. "You sure, human? This stuff burns through most species' stomachs." Elias smirked. "Pour." The glass was set in front of him, filled with a dark amber liquid that smelled like fire and regret. He lifted it to his lips, taking a slow sip, letting the burn settle in his throat. It wasn't bad. Not Earth whiskey, but close enough. The shift in the room was subtle, but Elias felt it immediately. A presence, heavy and full of bad intentions, moving toward him. He didn't need to turn around to know what was coming. A shadow loomed over him, and then a voice, deep and guttural. "Io." Elias exhaled slowly before setting his glass down. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see the towering figure behind him. A Bractal, 8 feet of bone-plated muscle, red eyes burning with barely contained aggression. The species was known for their strength and short tempers, and this one looked eager to prove something. "You're sitting in my seat," the Bractal growled. Elias didn't move. He glanced at the empty seats surrounding him, then back at the alien. Plenty of other seats around. The Bractal's lips curled back, revealing rows of sharp teeth. A clawed hand slammed onto the counter, making the bottles rattle. The bartender took a cautious step back. "You must not know how things work here," the Bractal said. "You move, or I break you." Elias turned fully now, his blue eyes locking onto the aliens. The bar was silent. Everyone was watching, waiting. "I'll tell you how things work," Elias said calmly. "You walk away and we both enjoy our drinks. Or—" He picked up his glass, downing the rest of the whiskey in one slow, deliberate motion. "You don't." For a moment there was only silence. Then the Bractal roared and swung a massive fist toward Elias's head. Elias moved before the blow could land. He ducked, twisting in his seat, grabbing the alien's wrist and wrenching it in a direction it wasn't meant to go. A sickening crack echoed through the bar. The Bractal howled in pain, but Elias wasn't done. He brought his elbow up, driving it into the alien's throat with brutal precision. The warrior staggered back, gasping for air, before crumpling to the floor. The bar was still for half a second. Then chaos erupted. The Bractal's friends surged forward, their instincts overriding any common sense they might have had. A Dracorian, its 6 eyes burning with rage, lunged at Elias with a plasma dagger. Elias sidestepped, grabbing a bottle off the counter and smashing it against the alien's skull. The Dracorian dropped without a sound. Another attacker came from behind. A Zyphorian, its long reptilian tail snapping forward like a whip, wrapped around Elias's neck. He gritted his teeth as the pressure tightened, his vision darkening at the edges. With a grunt, he grabbed a chair and drove its legs into the creature's ribs. The Zyphorian hissed in pain, its grip loosening just enough for Elias to twist free. More bodies piled onto him. He moved fast, efficiently, every strike calculated to disable, to end the fight as quickly as possible. He wasn't stronger than them, not physically, but he didn't need to be. Humans weren't the biggest, the fastest, or the most resilient species in the galaxy. They were just the deadliest. A brawler with 4 arms swung at him in rapid succession. Elias weaved between the strikes, stepping inside the alien's reach before driving his knee up into its gut. As it doubled over, he grabbed a nearby drinking glass and shattered it against the side of its head. Unsettled by the rage, Elias closed his eyes and prayed for strength. Strength came in the form of peaceful light. A hulking Grawl beast charged him like a battering ram, its thick hide nearly impervious to blunt force. Elias grabbed a discarded plasma dagger from the floor, sidestepping at the last second and slashing deep across the creature's knee joint. The Grawl stumbled, howling in pain, before Elias delivered a final merciless kick to the side of its head. It went down, hard. The fight was over before most of them even realized what had happened. Groans filled the air as bodies lay sprawled across the bar floor, some unconscious, others too broken to move. Elias adjusted his coat, rolling his shoulders as if he had just finished a light workout. His knuckles were bruised, his breathing steady. He turned back to the bar, picking up his glass, empty now, but he held it anyway. The bartender, who had wisely taken cover behind the counter, slowly straightened. His mandibles twitched as he stared at Elias with wide, disbelieving eyes. What the hell are you?" the bartender asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elias exhaled, setting the empty glass down. He smirked. The silence in the bar was suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. The remaining patrons, the ones who hadn't been foolish enough to join the fight, were staring at him with a mixture of shock and something else. Something deeper. Fear. Elias wasn't surprised. The galaxy had always underestimated humans. They wouldn't make that mistake again. The scent of blood and spilled alcohol mixed in the air, a metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat. Elias exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders as he surveyed the aftermath. The bar had been reduced to a battlefield, bodies groaning on the floor, broken tables and shattered glass scattered across the room, the dim lights flickering like they were barely holding on. The rusted Talon had seen its fair share of fights, but nothing like this, not a one-sided massacre executed with such cold efficiency. Elias reached for the bottle of whiskey still sitting on the counter and poured himself another drink. The bartender hesitated for only a second before handing him a fresh glass, his mandibles twitching as he cautiously stepped back. "You're alive," the bartender finally said as if he needed to confirm it. Elias smirked. "Looks that way." A low groan from behind him made him turn slightly. The Braktal, the first one to start this mess, was still on the ground, clutching his shattered wrist, his massive chest heaving. His red eyes, filled with rage before, now held something else, something new. Elias had seen that look before, the moment a predator realized it had just tried to attack something higher on the food chain. The Braktal struggled to sit up, his breathing labored. What are you?" he rasped. Elias tossed back the whiskey, savoring the burn before setting the glass down. He locked eyes with the Braktal, let the silence stretch just long enough to make sure the words that followed would settle deep into the alien's mind. "I already told you," he said. "I'm human." The Braktal flinched as if the word itself had weight. Elias sighed, rubbing a hand through his hair. He hadn't come here to make enemies. He had just wanted a drink. But now things had changed. He could feel it in the air, in the way the other patrons were watching him, not just with fear, but with something close to reverence, like they had just witnessed something that wasn't supposed to be possible. He had just rewritten the rules. The sound of boots scuffing against the floor pulled Elias's attention toward the entrance. A group of new arrivals stood just inside the doorway, their faces hidden beneath helmets and breathing masks. But their posture screamed authority. The symbol on their armor, a jagged insignia resembling a broken blade, confirmed it. Xyrax 7 didn't have a government, but it did have its own version of law enforcement, the Blood Vultures. They weren't peacekeepers. They were enforcers, hired by the highest bidder, running protection rackets and keeping just enough order to make sure the planet's black market continued to thrive. And judging by the way their weapons were already half drawn, Elias had their full attention. One of them, the tallest of the group, stepped forward. His voice was distorted through his helmet speaker, cold and synthetic. "Heard there was some trouble here." The bartender, still tense, gestured toward the wreckage of his bar. "Bad be him," he said, nodding toward Elias. The Blood Vulture tilted his head slightly, as if sizing him up. "You started this?" Elias shrugged. "Depends on your definition of start." The leader took another step forward. "You just put down a Brockthal and half his crew. That's impressive." Elias didn't say anything. The Blood Vulture continued. "Thing is, the Brockthal work for us. That means you just stepped on our territory." Brockthal looked. Elias sighed. He had been hoping to avoid something like this. He reached for the whiskey bottle again, pouring himself another drink, taking his time before responding. "Didn't know you owned the place," he said casually. "We own everything on this planet." Elias took a sip. "That so?" The Blood Vulture's hand tightened on the grip of his sidearm. "Yeah, and that means you've got a problem." Elias set his glass down, turning fully to face them. The rest of the bar had gone completely silent again, watching, waiting. They could all feel it, the static charge in the air before the storm. Elias had already done enough fighting for one night, but if they were going to force his hand... The Blood Vulture moved first, reaching for his weapon. Elias reacted instantly. His hand shot forward, grabbing the enforcer's wrist before the gun could clear its holster. With a sharp twist, he forced the arm downward and drove his other fist into the man's throat. The impact sent the Blood Vulture staggering back, choking on his own breath. The rest of them barely had time to react before Elias was already moving. He lunged toward the next enforcer, stepping inside his guard and delivering a brutal knee to the gut. As the enforcer doubled over, Elias grabbed his helmet and slammed it against the counter, cracking the visor. The man collapsed in a heap. Two more pulled their weapons, but Elias was faster. He grabbed a broken chair leg from the floor and hurled it like a spear, striking one of them square in the throat. The enforcer went down, gasping for air. The last one managed to get his gun up, but before he could fire, Elias was already on him. He wrenched the weapon from the man's grip and flipped it around, pressing the barrel against his temple. The enforcer froze. Elias's voice was low, even. "Walk away." The man hesitated, then slowly raised his hands. Elias released him, stepping back as the enforcer stumbled toward his remaining conscious comrades. The leader, still clutching his throat, managed to glare at Elias through his cracked visor. "This isn't over," he rasped. Elias smirked. "It never is." The Blood Vultures gathered their wounded and backed toward the door, their anger barely contained. But none of them made another move. They had seen what Elias was capable of. They wouldn't make the mistake of underestimating him again. As the enforcers disappeared into the night, the bar remained silent. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak. Elias sighed, rolling his neck before turning back to the counter. "I think I'll take that bottle to go," he said. The bartender, still looking at him like he was some kind of ancient war god, didn't argue. He slid the bottle across the counter. Elias took it, tipping an imaginary hat before making his way toward the door. As he stepped outside, the cool night air hit him, washing away the stench of blood and smoke. He could already hear distant sirens, probably more blood vultures or some other gang looking to settle a score. Didn't matter. He hadn't come to Zyark 7 looking for a fight. But the galaxy had just learned a lesson it wouldn't soon forget. Humans weren't the strongest species. They weren't the fastest. They weren't the most advanced. But they were something far worse. They were the deadliest. The air outside the rusted Talon was thick with the acrid scent of smoke and ozone, the kind that clung to the back of the throat and warned of incoming trouble. The neon signs above the street flickered erratically, their dull hum barely noticeable over the distant wail of sirens and the low murmur of the late-night crowd. Elias walked slowly, his coat brushing against his legs, the whiskey bottle clutched loosely in one hand. His body ached. Not from exhaustion, but from impact, from the countless blows he had given and received inside the bar. It was a familiar pain, one that came with living the kind of life he did. Zyark 7 wasn't the kind of place you fought and walked away from without consequences. He had just humiliated the blood vultures in front of half the scum on this planet. That kind of thing didn't go unanswered. They weren't going to let him leave without making a statement of their own. He could already feel the weight of unseen eyes tracking his movements, could sense the shift in the air, the way the usual noise of the streets seemed to dim as he stepped further away from the bar. The hunters were already closing in. He turned down a side street, a narrow alley where flickering holo signs cast jagged shadows against the walls. The bottle in his hand was half empty, but he wasn't drunk. He never drank enough to dull his edge. There was a difference between taking the burn for pleasure and letting it slow your reflexes. The first attack came just as he expected. A shadow detached itself from the wall to his right, lunging forward with a plasma blade aimed at his ribs. Elias twisted, sidestepping the thrust, just in time to catch the glint of metal before his attacker overextended. He grabbed the wrist, twisting it outward until the blade clattered to the ground, then drove an elbow straight into the assailant's face. There was a sharp crack of bone, a muffled grunt, and the figure collapsed. Two more emerged from the darkness. One was a Zyphorian, the same species that had tried to choke him in the bar. This one was leaner, faster. The other was a Grawl, all brute strength and thick hide, moving toward him like a living battering ram. Elias didn't wait for them to attack, he moved first. He darted toward the Zyphorian, closing the distance before it could react. It tried to snap its tail around his legs, but he anticipated the movement, kicking upward at just the right moment to disrupt its balance. As the alien stumbled, he grabbed the back of its head and drove it down into his rising knee. The impact sent it sprawling. The Grawl was already charging. Elias barely had time to register the bulk of the alien before it slammed into him, the force of the impact sending him crashing backward into the alley wall. Pain flared up his spine, but he gritted his teeth and rolled with it, letting the momentum carry him just enough to avoid getting pinned. The Grawl roared, swinging a massive fist toward his head. Elias ducked, letting the strike smash into the concrete behind him instead. The moment the fist made contact, Elias was already moving. He shifted under the alien's guard, pulling a small combat knife from the inside of his coat. Before the Grawl could react, Elias drove the blade deep into the soft flesh just beneath its ribs. The alien howled, staggering backward, clutching the wound. Elias didn't give it time to recover. He grabbed the plasma blade from the ground, the one his first attacker had dropped, and spun it in his grip before lunging forward, slicing a clean arc across the Grawl's exposed throat. The body hit the ground with a heavy thud. Elias stood over it, breathing hard, his pulse steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He wiped the knife against his sleeve before tucking it away again. The other two attackers weren't dead, but they weren't getting up anytime soon either. He turned, stepping back into the main street. The glow of the city lights illuminated his path, casting long shadows as he walked. He knew this wasn't over. The blood vultures didn't just send a few goons to take care of their problems. They would escalate. They always did. By the time he reached the edge of the sector, the streets were nearly empty. He could see the docking bays in the distance, where ships were lined up like slumbering beasts waiting for their next destination. His own ship, the Wayfarer, was among them, tucked away in a private hangar he had paid extra to keep off the official records. It had already been predetermined that he would stay off the records until Bradley was ready to sail. Elias didn't get the chance to make it that far. A deep, mechanical hum filled the air, followed by the sound of heavy boots against metal. He turned slowly, eyes narrowing as he saw the group waiting for him at the entrance of the docking yard. At least 10 of them, heavily armed. The blood vultures weren't playing anymore. The leader stepped forward, the same one from the bar, now sporting a reinforced helmet and a high-powered plasma rifle strapped across his chest. The others spread out in a loose semicircle, cutting off any escape routes. "You made a mistake," the leader said. His voice was calm, measured, but the tension in his stance told Elias everything he needed to know. Elias exhaled. "Seems to be a theme tonight. You think you're something special, human?" The leader took another step forward. "We've put down bigger threats than you." Elias tilted his head. "That's so." The leader's hand twitched toward his weapon. "This is your last chance. Surrender, and maybe we let you live." Elias considered it. Not because he planned to surrender, but because he was gauging the odds, counting the angles, measuring the distance between himself and the closest piece of cover. Then he sighed. "See, the problem with that offer," he said, "is that it assumes you have the upper hand." The leader scoffed. 10 against 1. I'd say that's a safe assumption." Elias smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "Then you don't know much about humans." The first shot came a second later. Elias dropped low, dodging the initial plasma burst as he rolled behind a stack of metal crates. The second shot barely missed, sizzling against the ground where he had just been standing. He popped up from cover, firing his stolen plasma pistol twice. 2 precise shots, one hitting a vulture in the knee, the other striking another in the shoulder. Both went down, screaming. And he was moving again. He grabbed a discarded energy grenade from one of the fallen mercenaries in the alley, yanking the pin before tossing it toward the group. The explosion sent 2 more flying, their armor absorbing most of the impact, but still leaving them disoriented. That left 6. Elias darted forward, closing the gap before they could recover. He slammed into the nearest one, wrenching the rifle from their hands and flipping it around before firing a shot point-blank into their chest. The force sent the body flying backward. "Ah!" 5. The next 2 came at him together, their weapons drawn. Elias ducked under the first shot, kicking the legs out from beneath one of them before driving an elbow into the second's throat. He grabbed the fallen mercenary's sidearm, firing twice, once at each. 3. The leader cursed, barking orders at the last 2 remaining. Elias didn't give them time to regroup. He grabbed a fallen rifle, adjusting his grip before letting off a controlled burst of fire. The energy rounds tore through armor, sending the last 2 blood vultures to the ground. The leader was alone now. Elias stepped forward, the rifle still raised. The leader, to his credit, didn't flinch. You can't keep doing this," the enforcer rasped. "You're one man." Elias tilted his head, considering the words. Then he smiled. "That's all it takes." The last shot echoed through the night. When it was over, Elias exhaled slowly, lowering the rifle. He turned, walking toward his ship without looking back. The galaxy had underestimated humans for too long. Now they knew better.